Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. This episode is covering some sensitive topics. We talk about car collisions and car crashes and the emergency department. I just want to encourage you to please listen with care and feel free to skip if it's too much, but it does have some really important information. I would encourage you to listen right to the very end if you can, because there's lots of useful, informative reminders and issues about the limitations of the car and the changing way that we are driving. So if you can manage it, it would be great if you could listen, but it is important that you stay within your limitations. Thanks. We are doing one of our People and Projects episodes. We are on the Yagurrabal Nation of the Gubbi Gubbi people, or perhaps I should have said it the other way around. I do apologise. And I am here with my very long-standing friend. I think we've been friends for 20 years, with Jamie, who I know you from a course that we both attended 20 years ago. And you worked in the emergency department. And so I thought it would be really good to just chat with you about what is it like in the emergency department after a car crash or a collision. And obviously paramedics bring people in different states. So some people will go to the morgue, some people will go to ICU, intensive care unit. Some people are going to be waiting around to be seen. Just perhaps explain a little bit about your experience and what you have noticed about car collisions over that time that you have been working, because you've been working a long time.
Yeah, look, thanks for inviting me onto the podcast. It's always a bit of a surprise when someone wants to know what I think about anything, really. Yeah, I guess most of the listeners will have been to the emergency department once or twice. There's always a question around what the point of the emergency department is, and one of my colleagues once was doing a bit of a meeting. He sort of spoke to the other doctors around, well, you know, the heart specialists, they know more about heart attacks and they often whinge we don't do it really well. And, you know, the eye specialists feel that we don't look after eyes very well, they can do it better. And that's probably the way it should be, because after all, it's their specialty. So, you know, what is it that emergency departments are kind of specialised in? And his answer was chaos. And I think that's a pretty reasonable view. Whatever you end up in an emergency department for, almost nobody wants to be there. So that of itself is pretty, can be pretty distressing. And they're really labour-intensive industries. So I remember, we once did a thing and noted that, the average person, if you were lying in one of those beds for 4 hours, then you'd probably encounter 82 different people over that time. And what were they doing and why were they there? And you'd never met any of them before, and taking your clothes away and you're in those stupid hospital gowns that don't cover anything and leave you a bit exposed. So all of that kind of disempowerment and, waiting around for you don't know what is just is commonly part of the emergency department experience. If people end up there following a motor vehicle collision, it depends a little bit on how severe the paramedics have felt that the injuries probably are. 20 years ago, there was you just get taken to the nearest hospital. Probably about, around that same time in sort of the UK and the US, people were looking at how we might be able to do these things better. And they thought it might be a really good idea if they just asked the staff working in the various hospitals, do you want to be involved in managing road trauma? And if you didn't want to be involved in managing road trauma, if the hospital wasn't set up to do it or we didn't really want to do it, then maybe it would be better if we didn't take the patients with significant road trauma there. So usually if you've ended up in a motor vehicle collision and you look like you've got quite significant injuries, then you'll probably be taken to the nearest trauma centre, which I think for this region is still the Royal rather than Caboolture or Reddy. If you seem to be walking and talking and have some just look like you've probably got a bit of bruising as being your primary problem, or maybe a single bony injury, you might end up in Caboolture or Redcliffe. But if the paramedics are concerned that you've got anything more potentially serious going on, then they're likely to take you down to the Royal. And that of itself can be a bit dislocating, because while for the paramedics it's just a trip down the road, if you're not that mobile and pretty limited, living pretty much in Caboolture, then it's basically a trip out of where not your normal existence is, and that can itself be quite destabilising before you start. And then you end up being discharged at 2 o'clock in the morning with the idea that you'll somehow get home. When you arrive in the emergency department, they'll basically take a quick look at you and pretty much split you into spaces depending on whether or not they think your breathing or your blood pressure and heart rate look like they're off, and you might need quite a lot of sudden medical intervention, through to there doesn't seem your brain, your heart and your lungs look like they're working okay, and you can probably sit around in a chair for a while. And so there's that sort of decision made around how unwell you appear to be when you first rock up. If you come from a motor vehicle collision and they conclude that you might be a bit unwell or significantly unwell, then you'll end up in a sort of relatively large space, one of the resus bays. One of the first things that will happen there in that context is you'll lose all your clothes, which again is quite a disempowering experience. One of my stories from the States where they take things a little bit more dramatically than this is, there was this guy who the helicopter radioed ahead to Baltimore, I think it was, announcing that, bringing in an aggressive male, and they needed some wardsmen on hand to deal with this aggressive male. And, the guy gets really, and he's yelling, get off me. And then, the big wardies sort of descend and cut all his clothes off with scissors. And then the medical staff come and find out what's gone on. And the traffic was stopped, and he sort of got out to see what was happening, and he saw some blood, and he didn't like blood, so he sat on a chair, and then he sort of sat down on the ground, and then the helicopter people descended and scooped him up and thought that he might be a major road trauma with poor blood pressure, and so he's ended up in this trauma centre with all of the systems just swinging into play to make sure that his heart's working okay, his blood pressure's okay, is there any sign of any internal bleeding. So for those sorts of scenarios, there's quite a lot of people and quite a lot of chaos, and then quite a lot of action. And then there'll be periods of less activity while we're waiting for things to come back and just seeing how the person, how they've stabilised over the time. So that's the sort of major centre. And then at the other end, if what you've got is it seems like you've ended up with, an injured ankle, then you'll end up waiting to have your ankle checked out and maybe x-rayed, and then some delay, and then possibly a plaster, and then some delay. So that's sort of the initial.
Yeah, that's good. BITRE, B-I-T-R-E. I think it's the government, Australian federal government figures. So they provided a whole lot of statistics and numbers, and I broke it down into small numbers because, it's just easier for me to be able to understand that. And the way that I recall the calculation was that it came down to, on average, 3 people a day were killed in a car crash, and 2 people left a collision with a disability. So, and then there are a whole lot of sort of collisions that happen at home because people in their driveways, they don't see, they have poor visibility sometimes around their cars. What I was really surprised when I started looking at the figures for Get Around and trying to understand what is it about cars and the land space and all sorts of different things about the money and the stats and everything, was I actually didn't think that 3 people a day were killed on the car. So that surprised me. And that 2 people an hour would be left with a disability. So I was quite surprised at the amount of injury, actually. Yeah, and death.
We were just reflecting on this a little earlier, and certainly in one of the trauma centres that I'd worked in, about a third of the inpatient beds were occupied by trauma patients of one form or another. And certainly I think the majority of those would have been road trauma. I don't have the stats at my fingertips, and that was an impression. The rates of death are probably a bit less than they were when I first started. Over the time that I've been working, I think there's been a bit of improvement in the road network. I do remember when the Princess Highway was pretty much one lane each way.
Yeah. I mean, that you're talking about sort of the mid-'80s, I think, when you first started working
a little bit
in
later.
that
But
space.
yeah. So there's been a substantial amount of money's gone into trying to improve change the road structure, and that's just an expense that's often ignored, how much that actually costs. I think the engineering in the cars is better than it was, and it's kind of like community attitudes a bit around safety belt wearing and also drink driving have substantially changed from when I started working. It was quite common that, 30, 40-year-olds would be plastered and behind the wheel when I started working, whereas that's pretty uncommon now. We still do see it, but it's much more likely to be the 17 to 25-year-old guys who are in that sort of space. I think we were speaking earlier and your feeling was that there might be a little bit of an uptick in...
Yeah, so the stats, so what they've sort of realised is that you haven't been working in the emergency department.
Hadn't had much to do with trauma in the last couple of years, no.
Yeah, because the SUVs and the big monster trucks, they're bigger, the physics is, they're heavier, so that it takes longer to stop. They're good at signalling front and back when there's somebody, in front or behind. The beeping, yes. But they actually aren't very good going around corners. And so we went down to the supermarket and there was a woman and she was just walking along, and I was quite surprised that you didn't notice that she was right there. I was very aware of her. But of course, I was on the left-hand side, you were on the right-hand side.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it was a car that I was unfamiliar with. It was a car park that I'm unfamiliar with. Yeah. I wasn't quite sure whether I was driving ahead or turning to that direction, then decided that actually it would turn that way because it'd be easier. And yeah, she was just in a position next to the side pillar and the thing, and didn't, out of the corner of my eye, I just didn't see her at all. And
you're actually quite a vigilant person, like you're that's your sort of long-standing personality. But also in the emergency department, there's lots of going on, and you're always kind of got a bit of an eye out everywhere.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think your suggestion about the increased SUVs, just thinking about the cars that you see driving around, there's no question that they seem to be bigger and heavier than, the average car's bigger and heavier than it was, certainly 10 years ago and probably even 5 years ago. They are going to take longer to stop in the rain, even with their braking and whatever. That's just the way that it is.
50% of cars are SUVs now. And the other thing is that I met somebody, I think it was last year, and I said, these big cars. And she said, I've got a small car. And I looked at her car. And when I was growing up, a small car was...
a Mini.
Well, I think that was a Mini. Yeah, I think that was...
An actual Mini.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite small, sort of maybe the length of 1.5 people. But she was sort of the length of 2 people. It was just completely long. So the sort of whole proportion, the ratio is completely different today than how it was then. I wanted to ask also about, were there any personality dispositions that you found tended to be more likely to end up in collisions? Were more men or women in collisions, or...
Yeah, we were just reflecting on that earlier. I've not seen any stats on it, and we certainly haven't done any formal studies on it. There's no question that the average person injured in a motor vehicle accident is likely to be relatively young. 18, 19, through maybe to 28 is probably most of our, bony injuries, and a lot of our people who end up in intensive care units following some sort of trauma like this. I think there's often a little bit more of that invulnerability. I thought I'd just get through. I can think of a number of people that I know of who were involved in agricultural instrument injuries or motor vehicle collisions where they, it was clear that they thought they'd be okay, or they'd just, push through it. I mean, this theme's pretty common with some of the other stuff as well. The SES talking about floodwater stuff, who is going to push through and who's going to accept that actually they're not indestructible, and so...
Yeah. Well, I have a bike, and it's a big, bright orange bike, and it's sort of like the SUV of the cargo e-bike world. It's got a box at the front, a box at the back. I wear high vis. I've got a big helmet.
Yeah.
I was crossing the pedestrian crossing up on King Street down to go to Morayfield Road, and somebody actually ran through the red light from Morayfield Road, turning right up into King Street. It was a red light because I had the little green man in my favour.
Yeah.
And so I was, what the are you doing? I still have his shock.
You've got an image in you
Yeah.
of his shock.
I think people underestimate the impact, what could happen if you go through a red light. I don't know whether people are misjudging how fast they're going, or they are going around a corner. Well, there's never any pedestrians, so why would that be a problem? Or because certainly I see a lot of that. A friend of mine, I was in her car once and I was completely terrified because she had a couple of joints and it was quite early in the morning, and I was completely terrified, and she was telling me how confident she was. It was an absolutely awful experience.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? And the growth of medical marijuana. I've heard a couple of sort of podcasts recently about how appalling and unfair it is that I'm on my medical marijuana and the laws as if regarding me as intoxicated, and I'm going, yeah, I'm just not quite sure about this just yet.
I was just looking while I was waiting for you before, the Fatal Five, so I think it's speeding, seatbelts, and driving under the influence. And it's driving under the influence of alcohol, illegal drugs, and also medications. So it's one of the Fatal Five, so that stands in that one. And distractions, so mobile phones, that's the other one. So I guess when people arrive in the emergency department, I guess by that stage, it's probably, depending on how far away the collision is, it's probably an hour, hour and a half, something like that. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, oftentimes, and depending on the service that you're in, but yeah.
Yeah. So, and then they come in just in high levels of distress, obviously, and confusion. I guess there's so much waiting around in the department. I was just thinking, what is the psychological impact that you see? I guess there's still so much in shock when they arrive. Whether you see people who go, but I just didn't think I would have a car crash, or it was nothing to do with me, I was innocent, and maybe that's true. What sort of psychological impacts you see straight up, or maybe that come back later?
A lot of the time when I'm engaging with that sort of thing with the people in the emergency department, certainly the sort of more acutely injured are still, it's still very unclear where everything's going. So they're not really in a space where they're able to process any information or sort out where it is. They're still in a bit of a state of overwhelm, and that will continue for a while. I think the kind of thing that perhaps touches in a little bit more to what you're wondering about is the people that I've sometimes seen with sort of single long bone injuries. They've ended up with a bit of a broken leg or a bit of a broken arm. And, much as I remember, I had a broken leg when I broke my leg when I was 39. And in spite of the fact that I worked in that industry for quite a long time, I had never actually kind of thought through what happened next. The discovery from first of all, I knew I'd have a broken leg and I'd be, on crutches for a while, and I thought this was going to be quite good because I had all this stuff that I needed to catch up on. I'd be at home, I wouldn't be able to go to work, so that'd be great, I'd be off. It wasn't until I got home that I realised that actually you're pretty disabled if you're on crutches and not weight bearing. Like, I'm sitting on the couch and if I need a cup of something or a glass of water or something and I have to go to the kitchen and I'm not carrying that back to the couch, I've got to drink it there. There's actually not a lot you can do, all of the stuff that I thought I'd just get done. So that sense of surprise about the impact of what I'd regard as a relatively straightforward, quite common, uncomplicated injury on my, on how I could get about living my life. And then also the sense of how long it would take. I remember seeing the orthopedic guy in the fracture clinic and him just saying, okay, so this is all coming along okay, and so we'll make another appointment to see how the healing is coming along in a year. I'm going, what do you mean coming along in a year? Until you've actually had a bit of an injury, the realisation around what that actually means and how long a rehab might take, and in fact how you might never actually get back to exactly where you were before.
Were you able to drive during that one? So was it a whole year before you got better?
Oh, my leg's never been the same since.
Yeah.
I can walk on it, I can drive on it, I could jog on it if I was a jogging kind of person. Perhaps I should become. But I think I was off work for 9 weeks. Yeah, and on crutches for most of that time. I was lucky that it was my left leg. I could drive the automatic from about week 6 once the whole leg plaster came off. But if it had been the right leg, then there'd have been no driving for a good 3 months. And these kind of suburban landscapes that we're talking about that are all up and down the Australian East Coast if you can't drive.
It's really terrible. You I think, were single at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you must see sort of families come into the emergency department, and you've got all these sort of interpersonal family dynamics and people actually having to stop their jobs, not only the person who's injured, but also carers who have to step in, and also the financial implications. You may or may not be aware of what happens in that. Is that one of the big things that people suddenly dawn on? But we've got a mortgage and we've got a car and we've got kids and how are we going to make it all end? Or is that just not part of the conversation?
I think it depends on the family and on the people involved and how that happens. Certainly, when I broke my leg, I was taken to a regional emergency department where I worked in the past. A year or so later, one of my colleagues from there, I saw them at the airport or something, and she said, I just saw you with that. It just occurred to me that had happened really quickly, and I was the primary breadwinner for our family, and if that happened to me, what would happen? You often need something like that. One of the challenges I think for me recently was, I think it was probably about 6 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer, with some of the changes to the Centrelink stuff. And there used to be a sort of sickness pension, a sickness payment that was just different to the unemployment payment. And that I found that, that seemed to me to be really helpful for people. And now, because it was accepted that if you actually had an injury, then there was none of this requirement to be hunting for work if you actually, couldn't really get out of bed or out of your chair. Whereas all of that is now kind of rolled into the one thing. And I think that's certainly going to be adding stress and challenge to some of these situations.
Yeah, because, the cost of living crisis, you live in a different city and you have, a bit more financial buffer than many people here.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate like that.
Yeah, but if you've got a mortgage and you've got one person who's off and then, you've got to get the kids and who's going to care for the kids, because it depends on who's sort of injured. And also the pain. So do you get many people coming in with sort of chronic pain or a lot of pain management need from a collision? Maybe not at the time, but, coming back, my arm, it's always never been, it's never been the same since the collision, X amount of time, and I just can't bear the pain.
We do see a little bit of that. We tend not to see as much as I did, because even though they're still a bit patchy, there are a few more services, the system's set up a little bit more to cater to some of those people. I guess the thing that I'd see with many of these injuries, which are not uncommon, a single broken arm is manageable. 2 broken arms is a significant challenge.
Yeah.
A single broken leg, if you can't weight bear, then you're going to need some support and you're pretty much out of action. I don't know that you can look after dependent children at all if you've got a broken leg that you can't weight bear on. And so you're typically looking there at about 3 months of significant disruption to what people's lives are normally like before it starts to get back on track. And as you say, with the cost of living increase, the way that things are sitting at the moment, that's a significant stressor.
Was there anything else we were talking about before that would be useful to add?
I guess the only other thing that we had sort of briefly touched on with the sort of change in or increasing technology associated with the engineering, and as we were again thinking about that experience earlier today, the cars that go beep, you sort of get out of the habit of checking behind you. The cars that, there's just this belief, this sort of settling into this, supported by the technology in a way where you're less vigilant and less aware and more reliant and de-skilled, and just, the challenges associated with that.
As you were saying that, one of the things I thought about is now cars are so hermetically sealed. So every now and again, I hear a radio playing as I sort of walk along or cycle along. And it's such a surprise, because I remember when, in the 80s and 90s, you'd hear people's car radios go off all the time, because everybody had their car windows open. Now they're hermetic, they're closed. You've got aircon. You've got a lot of gadgets and your mobile phone. All that sort of stuff.
This complete cocoon.
Yeah, and so from that, you're really shut out from what is going on in the world. And my understanding of the road design is that it's called forgiving design, where although the road speed limit is 50 kilometres an hour, say, the actual design of the road is to allow for 60 kilometres an hour to reduce the collision, the fatality rates. That there is this false assumption there won't be a problem. I'm in this big car, which is an SUV, which, so many people drive now, and that gives the idea that that's very safe. We've got airbags and things like that, and that can be true, but it's actually not as true as you think, particularly if you have this more aggressive personality who tends to be in the social dominance.
Yeah, a bit of, sometimes it's the aggression, sometimes it's just a bit, she'll be right, mate, kind of thing, But there is this sense of cocooned and disconnected, and everything it's all safe and warm in here, and it is.
Yeah, well, that's right.
It is safe and warm in here. It's just that there are some rubber on the road.
Yeah. Well, and actually, so on Murrayfield Road, I was driving along, I was on my bike riding along, and a lot of people have these 8-foot fences now, and even shops, they have all these sort of, what do you call them, the shopping areas where you can have all the car parking in front of 5 shops kind of thing. And there's these fences or hedges that are quite high. And so this woman came out, and I was going along on the footpath at, whatever it was. Yep. And she was really surprised to see me. And startled. I'm just so grateful that I wear high vis and I have a bright orange bicycle. It was actually sort of, I think, the 3rd time or something like that I'd had one of these kind of experiences. So after that, I decided to ride on the road shoulder. Yeah, it just feels much safer to be away from that. It was good because she was actually she had a little bubby in the back, and she was quite sweet about it. I was very angry. It sort of triggered a whole lot of PTSD and made me very frightened. And I have had that experience where I've been cycling along on a bit of lane, which I'm perfectly entitled to do, and there was all the cars were parked in the road shoulder, so I couldn't go along there. And then this guy's just sort of intimidating me. He could easily have been in the right-hand lane, but he just decided he wasn't going to do that. He had a big monster truck. So there is this sort of sense of domination on the road that if you're in a car and it's my space and get out of the way, there is definitely a lot of that. And I could see that might create some collisions as well. One of the things, and this is quite a bit of a tricky one, one of the statistics I saw from KidSafe, which is a Queensland organisation which is about children's safety, on average 3 people a week in Queensland drive over their own children in their own driveway with their own car. I don't know if you have seen those sorts of situations, and I just go, how on earth could a family survive that kind of absolutely awful experience?
Yeah.
Whether you've seen any of that.
I have seen a number of the fallout from a number of situations over my time that would sort of fit into that space. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about it. It's usually it's completely horrific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think the level of heightened distress would be sort of even higher than in the normal place. It's all pretty awful.
Yeah.
All right. So, anything else?
I think we've sort of touched on to most of the things that...
Yeah, so basically I think the main thing is be extra aware when turning right or left into a side street, because your little sensors won't be looking out for any of that. Also, slower road speeds obviously reduce the fatality. If you're going along at 40 kilometres an hour and you hit a pedestrian, chances are that pedestrian will die. If you go along at 30 kilometres an hour, very high chance the person will live. They will actually sustain a lot of injuries.
Certainly, yes.
So just to be really aware, never drive under the influence of any substance. Don't use your mobile phone, and always wear a seatbelt, and don't be tired. That's the other thing. Fatigue that was one of the fatal 5 as well.
Certainly, I can certainly think of a number of fatigue-related things. I spent a bit of time working in Canberra, and we'd get every snow season there'd be people who'd set out from Sydney after work and plough into a tree on the sort of snowy highway somewhere down near Cooma or that sort of way at 6 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning or something. So fatigue, absolutely, and seat belts. Yeah,
I mean that speaks to the sort of she'll be right kind of.
Yeah,
and like not being careful enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much. Been
Thank you.
fantastic. I hope it has been okay for you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.